Rooks County, Kansas, September 1878. While his American neighbors raced to throw up frame houses before winter, Heinrich Zimmermann was still digging. 6 feet down into the prairie hillside, 14 by 20 feet wide, methodically lining his excavation with limestone blocks. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a prairie dog. Tom Morrison, hammering boards on his 16 by 20 frame house, laughed openly. Heinrich is building himself a cave while the rest of us are building homes. The German immigrant from the Volga region spent 6 weeks carefully fitting stones and cutting sod blocks, while others completed identical floor space in 10 days. They trusted American speed and lumber. He trusted earth that stayed 50 degrees year-round and thermal mass that stored heat like a battery. Then February 1881 arrived, the killing winter that would break plain settlement records. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero for 5 straight days. Winds hit 50 miles per hour. Morrison's frame house became uninhabitable despite burning wood every 2 hours around the clock. Interior temperature, 18 degrees. Heinrich's dugout, a steady 48 degrees using the same daily wood as moderate weather. Morrison arrived at Heinrich's door at midnight, carrying his youngest child, begging for shelter. What did this German immigrant understand about heat, earth, and survival that born Americans had dismissed as primitive? And how did his prairie dog hole become the warmest refuge in Kansas? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Kansas prairie as Heinrich Zimmermann shouldered his spade and walked toward the gentle slope behind his temporary sod shanty. September 15th, 1878, and while most settlers in Rooks County were racing against time to complete their frame houses before the first frost, Heinrich was just beginning what his neighbors would soon call the most foolish building project in the territory. He had chosen his spot with the deliberate care of a man who understood that location meant the difference between comfort and misery through 6 months of plains winter. The south-facing hillside caught maximum sun exposure, while the natural grade would channel spring runoff away from his foundation. Heinrich paced off the dimensions 14 feet by 20 feet and began marking the rectangle with stakes and string. His wife Anna watched from their temporary shelter, 3 children clustered around her skirts, as Heinrich drove his spade into the prairie sod for the first cut. The excavation would require removing nearly 1,700 cubic feet of earth, all by hand, all precisely measured to create walls that would bear the weight of a sod roof while maintaining the exact interior dimensions that generations of Volga German builders had proven most efficient for heating. Heinrich worked methodically, cutting the tough prairie sod in uniform blocks, saving the best pieces for his roof construction while using the broken earth to build windbreaks around his work site. By the 3rd day, word of Heinrich's project had spread throughout the township. Tom Morrison rode over on his bay gelding, dismounting to peer into the growing excavation that now descended 3 feet below ground level. Morrison had arrived from Ohio 2 years earlier with solid carpentry skills and unshakable confidence in American building methods. His own house was already taking shape, a 16 by 20 foot frame structure that would be completed within the week. "What in blazes are you doing, Heinrich?" Morrison called down into the pit. "Building yourself a root cellar big enough to live in?" Heinrich paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Building house that keeps family warm without burning forest of wood," he replied in his careful English. "In Volga region, earth house means living through winter. Frame house means maybe living through winter." Morrison shook his head with the patient amusement of a man watching a child make an obvious mistake. "This isn't Russia, Heinrich. We've got plenty of timber, and American methods work just fine. You're going to spend 6 weeks digging a hole in the ground when you could have a proper house built in 10 days. The criticism stung not because it questioned Heinrich's methods, but because it dismissed knowledge that had kept his family alive through Volga winters, where temperatures dropped to 30 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Heinrich's grandfather had taught him that Earth maintains a constant temperature of 50 degrees at 6 feet depth, warm enough to eliminate the killing cold, cool enough to provide relief from summer heat. This wasn't primitive construction. It was sophisticated thermal engineering using the planet itself as insulation. As September progressed, the contrast between Heinrich's deliberate pace and his neighbor's urgent construction became a source of community entertainment. The Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who had built a standard frame house, stopped by regularly to marvel at Heinrich's progress. Jan Kowalski would peer into the excavation, now 5 feet deep with stone walls beginning to take shape, and shake his head in bewilderment. "Heinrich," Jan said on a particularly warm afternoon, "winter comes same time for all of us. Tom Morrison's house has roof already. My house has roof. Your house has hole." Heinrich smiled as he fitted another limestone block into place, checking the level with his hand-carved wooden square. "Jan, you build house to look good before winter. I build house to feel good during winter." He gestured toward Morrison's frame house, where the carpenter was nailing final boards to the exterior walls. "Tom's house, very pretty, very fast. But when wind blows 30 miles an hour at 20 below zero, pretty house becomes very cold house, very quick." The stone lining progressed with the same methodical precision. Heinrich had located a limestone outcrop 2 miles from his homestead and spent days selecting blocks that would fit together with minimal chinking. The stones extended 18 inches below ground level and would rise 2 feet above grade, creating a foundation that would shed water while providing thermal mass to store and release heat. Each stone was fitted dry, then chinked with prairie clay mixed with chopped grass, a mortar that would expand and contract with freeze-thaw cycles without cracking. By early October, with the first hard frost only weeks away, Heinrich was ready to begin roof construction. He had cut and shaped timber beams from cottonwood trees along the creek, creating a frame that would support the massive weight of 18 inches of sod while spanning the 20-foot width without interior supports. The beam placement followed calculations his father had taught him, load distribution that accounted for both dead weight and live loads from snow accumulation that could reach 4 feet on the plains. Morrison stopped by during the timber raising, bringing several other neighbors who had come to witness what they assumed would be the collapse of Heinrich's amateur engineering. Instead, they watched the German immigrant demonstrate joinery techniques that created a roof frame stronger than anything they had seen in conventional construction. Heinrich cut mortise and tenon joints by hand, each connection fitted so precisely that the frame required no nails, only wooden pegs that would flex with seasonal wood movement rather than splitting like iron fasteners. "I'll grant you this, Heinrich," Morrison said, running his hand along a perfectly fitted joint. "You know your timber work, but all this effort for a house you can't even see from the road? What's the point of building something that looks like empty prairie?" Heinrich spread his arms to encompass the nearly completed structure. "Tom, your house tells everyone, 'Here lives Tom Morrison.' My house tells winter wind, 'Here lives nobody. Blow somewhere else.' Which house you think stays warmer?" The sod cutting began in mid-October, just as Heinrich's neighbors were banking earth around their frame houses for winter insulation. Heinrich selected sod from virgin prairie, cutting uniform blocks 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 4 inches thick. Each block weighed approximately 50 pounds and would be laid grass side down in 3 overlapping courses to create a roof that provided both insulation and protection from moisture. The bottom layer went grass down directly on the timber frame, the middle layer reversed with grass facing up, and the top layer again grass down to shed water. Anna Zimmerman worked alongside her husband, trimming sod blocks to exact dimensions and helping maneuver the heavy pieces into position. Their neighbors' wives watched from a distance, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed pity for a woman reduced to building her own house like a common laborer. Anna ignored the whispers. She had grown up in a Volga German community where women understood that survival depended on practical skills, not social appearances. The entrance presented the final challenge. Heinrich excavated a tunnel that angled down from ground level to the house interior, creating an airlock that would prevent wind from blowing directly into the living space. The tunnel was only 4 feet high, but wide enough for a grown man to pass through comfortably. A wooden door at the exterior end and another at the interior created a double barrier against heat loss, a feature that would prove crucial when winter temperatures made every degree of warmth precious. By November 1st, Heinrich's dugout was complete. The total construction had required $47 in materials, $23 for timber, $12 for tools, $8 for the sheet iron stove, and $4 for window glass and hardware. Morrison's frame house, by comparison, had cost $85 in lumber alone, not including labor costs that Heinrich had eliminated through family construction. Standing in his finished home, Heinrich surveyed the interior that would shelter his family through the coming winter. The limestone walls curved seamlessly into the earth banks, creating a space that felt more like a natural cave than a constructed building. 2 small windows faced south, positioned to capture maximum solar gain during the short winter days. Built-in furniture, beds, shelves, and a table maximized the limited floor space, while the central chimney location would distribute heat evenly throughout the single room. Anna lit the first fire in their new stove, and the family watched as warmth spread quickly through the compact space. The thermal mass of stone and earth absorbed heat during the day and would release it slowly through the night, creating the steady temperature that made underground living comfortable rather than merely survivable. Outside, the November wind was picking up, carrying the scent of snow from the northwest. Inside the dugout, the Zimmerman children played on the floor in their shirt sleeves, unaware that their father's foolish construction project was about to prove itself against the most severe test the Kansas plains could deliver. The first real cold snap arrived on November 12, 1878, dropping temperatures from a mild 45 degrees to 15 below zero in less than 12 hours. 30-mile-per-hour winds drove the temperature differential through every gap and crack in conventional construction, turning Tom Morrison's carefully built frame house into a drafty box that hemorrhaged heat faster than his wood stove could produce it. Morrison woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of his house groaning under wind pressure and the sharp crack of contracting lumber. Ice had formed on the interior walls near his windows, despite the fire he had banked before bed. He fed 4 split logs into his stove, opened the dampers wide, and huddled with his family in blankets while waiting for the cast iron to radiate enough heat to make the kitchen habitable. By dawn, he had burned through half a cord of wood, timber that should have lasted a week under normal circumstances. The problem lay in fundamental physics that Morrison's Ohio carpentry experience had never forced him to confront. His house contained 2,400 cubic feet of interior space enclosed by walls that provided an insulation value roughly equivalent to 2 inches of modern fiberglass. Every joint between boards, despite careful chinking, allowed cold air infiltration that created convection currents stealing heat from the interior. The elevated construction exposed his entire structure to wind cooling that dropped effective interior temperature by 10 to 15 degrees below what the same heating effort would achieve in a sheltered location. Morrison calculated his fuel consumption with growing alarm. 18 split logs in 12 hours, burned hot and fast just to maintain interior temperatures barely above freezing. At this rate, his carefully stockpiled wood supply would last 6 weeks instead of the 4 months he had planned. He needed a solution, and he needed it before the real winter arrived. Meanwhile, 100 yards away, Heinrich Zimmermann was discovering that his grandfather's thermal engineering worked exactly as promised. The dugout's interior temperature held steady at 52 degrees, with 2 modest fires per day, 6 split logs in the morning, 6 more in the evening. The limestone walls and earth banks absorbed heat from his small sheet iron stove during peak burning periods and released it gradually over the following 12 hours, creating a thermal flywheel that smoothed out temperature fluctuations. Anna Zimmermann baked bread that morning without the shivering misery that plagued other homestead wives during cold snaps. The dugout's compact interior, only 1,960 cubic feet compared to Morrison's 2,400, heated efficiently and stayed warm longer. The children played on the floor in light shirts while their mother worked at her spinning wheel, both activities impossible in the drafty frame houses where families huddled around stoves wearing every piece of clothing they owned. The thermal mass effect that Heinrich had built into his design was performing exactly as Volga German builders had refined it over generations of bitter steppes winters. The 50-degree base temperature of Earth at 6-foot depth provided a foundation of warmth that required only modest supplemental heating to reach comfortable living conditions. The limestone walls stored additional heat during firing periods and released it during the long hours between stokings, creating interior temperature stability that frame construction could never achieve. Morrison swallowed his pride on November 15th and walked through the bitter wind to Heinrich's dugout, ostensibly to check on his neighbor's welfare, but actually desperate to understand how the German family could remain comfortable while his own family fought a losing battle against the cold. He found Heinrich reading a German-language newspaper by the light of a kerosene lamp, sitting in his shirt sleeves at a wooden table where his children were working on arithmetic lessons. "Heinrich," Morrison said, accepting the offered chair near the stove, "I'll be honest with you. My house is eating wood like a hungry horse, and we're barely keeping above freezing. How much fuel are you burning to stay this warm?" Heinrich gestured toward his modest woodpile in the corner of the dugout. 6 pieces morning, 6 pieces evening, sometimes less when sun shines good through windows during day. He pointed to the south-facing openings where late afternoon light was streaming into the interior. Earth holds heat like big stone around cooking fire. Stove makes heat. Stone holds heat. Stone gives heat back slow all night. Morrison did the mathematics in his head and felt a sinking sensation. Heinrich was using in 1 week what Morrison burned in 30 hours. The efficiency differential wasn't slight. It was catastrophic for anyone trying to survive a plains winter using conventional construction methods. "But how do you manage the smoke and ventilation?" Morrison asked, studying the sheet iron stove that seemed impossibly small for the heating task. "And what about moisture buildup underground?" Heinrich explained the principles his father had taught him. The central chimney location distributed heat evenly throughout the single room, while the entrance tunnel created natural airflow that prevented stuffiness without causing heat loss. The limestone walls breathed enough to prevent condensation, while the sod roof absorbed excess moisture and released it gradually to the outside air. Most importantly, the earth surrounding his home maintained consistent humidity levels that prevented the extreme dryness that plagued overheated frame houses. The technical superiority was undeniable, but Morrison found himself grappling with social implications that went beyond thermal efficiency. A dugout looked like poverty to American eyes, like a step backward toward primitive living that immigrants were supposed to abandon in favor of proper civilization. His frame house announced to the community that Tom Morrison was a successful settler building American prosperity on the frontier. Heinrich's dugout announced nothing. It was virtually invisible from the road, indistinguishable from natural prairie except for the thin wisp of smoke from its chimney. "I understand the heating efficiency," Morrison said carefully, "but what happens come spring when you get flooding? And what do visitors think when they come calling on a family living underground?" Heinrich smiled with the patience of a man who had heard these objections before. "Tom, water follows path you give it. I cut drainage ditches around hill before building house. Rainwater runs away from house, not into house." He gestured toward the carefully engineered slopes that channeled runoff away from the structure. "And visitors?" Heinrich shrugged. "Visitors who matter care if family stays warm and healthy. Visitors who care only how house looks from road. Maybe those visitors not so important." The philosophical divide ran deeper than construction techniques. Morrison represented American frontier values that emphasized appearance, speed, and conformity to established building methods brought from milder climates. Heinrich embodied immigrant pragmatism that prioritized survival over social acceptance and trusted traditional knowledge over popular fashion. Both approaches reflected valid cultural values, but only one would prove sustainable when Plains weather reached its extremes. As November progressed toward December, the efficiency gap between frame and earth-sheltered construction widened with each cold snap. The Kowalski family found themselves burning 3 cords of wood per month, while struggling to maintain interior temperatures in the low 40s. Other frame house families faced similar fuel consumption crises, forced to choose between comfortable heating and financial ruin at $12 per cord for replacement timber. Heinrich's wood consumption remained constant regardless of outside temperature fluctuations. His thermal mass system was calibrated to work with Earth's steady properties, rather than fighting against atmospheric variables. The dugout required the same daily heating effort whether outside temperatures dropped to 0 or 20 below, a stability that made winter planning possible, rather than a desperate gamble against unknown weather severity. The social dynamics of the community began shifting as practical results overwhelmed cultural prejudices. Mrs. Morrison organized a church social for December 1st, but quietly suggested it be held at Heinrich's dugout since it was the only home in the township guaranteed to be warm enough for social gathering. The German immigrant family that neighbors had pitied in September was becoming the practical center of winter community life by December. January 1881 arrived with a meteorological violence that would etch itself into Plains settlement history as the benchmark against which all future winters would be measured. The month opened with a blizzard that dumped 3 feet of snow across Rooks County in 48 hours, followed immediately by an Arctic air mass that drove temperatures to 25 below zero and held them there for 2 weeks straight. Sustained winds of 40 to 50 miles per hour created ground. Blizzard conditions that turned the landscape into a howling white void where visibility dropped to 0 beyond arm's length. Tom Morrison's frame house became a battlefield against physics he had never been forced to understand. The structure that had seemed adequate during moderate cold now revealed itself as fundamentally unsuited to extreme plains weather. Wind-driven snow found every gap in his construction, forming drifts inside the house that required daily shoveling. Ice accumulated on interior walls despite continuous heating, and frost formed on the inside surface of windows so thick that scraping it clear became part of the morning routine. Morrison's fuel consumption exploded beyond all sustainable limits. He was feeding his stove every 2 hours around the clock, burning 10 to 12 split logs during each stoking just to maintain interior temperatures that struggled to reach 35 degrees. The mathematical reality was brutal: 18 to 20 logs per day, roughly 1.5 cords per week, with winter barely half finished. At current consumption rates, his wood supply would be exhausted by mid-February, leaving his family to face the worst months of Plains winter without fuel. The frame house's fatal flaw lay in its relationship to the environment it was supposed to shelter against. Every square foot of exterior wall surface was exposed to wind cooling that stripped heat from the interior faster than any reasonable heating system could replace it. The elevated construction that had seemed proper and civilized now acted as a sail that caught every wind current, while the thin walls provided no thermal mass to store heat during peak firing periods, or release it gradually during the hours between stokings. Jan Kowalski's situation had deteriorated to crisis levels even faster than Morrison's. His frame house, built with less experienced carpentry, leaked air through wall joints that created convection currents, stealing warmth from every corner of the interior. Kowalski was burning fence posts by mid-January, then boards from his wagon, then interior wall studs that left gaps in his home structure. His wife, Katerina, wrapped their infant in every blanket they owned and still worried that the child might freeze during the coldest hours before dawn. The broader community faced the same systematic failure of construction methods imported from milder climates. 3 other frame houses in the township were consuming wood at rates that threatened complete fuel exhaustion before spring. The Anderson family had started burning furniture when their wood pile ran low. The Swedish immigrants who had built a log cabin found their structure slightly more efficient than frame houses, but still requiring fuel consumption that would bankrupt them if the winter continued much longer. The crisis revealed the fundamental miscalculation that had led American settlers to trust conventional construction in an unconventional climate. Plains winters were not longer versions of Ohio or Illinois cold snaps. They were qualitatively different weather events that required engineering solutions calibrated to sustained extreme conditions rather than brief temperature drops. Frame houses that worked adequately in forested regions with milder winters became death traps when exposed to the sustained wind and cold that characterized high plains weather systems. Heinrich Zimmermann's dugout continued operating with the same fuel efficiency that had characterized its performance during moderate cold, demonstrating thermal stability that seemed almost magical to his struggling neighbors. Interior temperature held steady between 48 and 55 degrees depending on solar gain through the south-facing windows, achieved with the same 12 split logs per day that had proven adequate since November. The earth-sheltered walls remained unaffected by surface wind or air temperature, maintaining their steady thermal mass function regardless of atmospheric conditions above ground. The dugout's superior performance during extreme cold validated every principle that Heinrich's grandfather had taught him about working with natural thermal properties rather than fighting against them. The 50-degree base temperature of deep earth provided a foundation of warmth that external weather could not disturb. The limestone walls stored heat from modest fires and released it gradually over 12-hour cycles, creating interior climate stability that frame construction could never achieve regardless of fuel input. Anna Zimmermann maintained her normal domestic routines while other homestead wives struggled to survive. She baked bread twice weekly, spun wool in the afternoons, and kept her children engaged in lessons at the wooden table where kerosene lamplight provided adequate illumination for reading and writing. The children played on the floor without the heavy coats and mittens that had become indoor clothing for frame house families, and Anna herself worked comfortably in a wool dress that would have provided insufficient warmth in any other structure in the township. Morrison began spending increasing amounts of time at Heinrich's dugout, ostensibly checking on his neighbor's welfare, but actually seeking relief from his own home's bitter interior temperature. Each visit extended longer as Morrison found excuses to delay returning to his frigid house, where his family huddled around an overtaxed stove that consumed wood faster than he could split it. The conversations during these visits had evolved from social calls to desperate consultations about heating efficiency and fuel conservation. "Heinrich, I need to understand exactly how you're managing this." Morrison said during a particularly brutal afternoon when wind chills approached 60 below zero. My family is burning through our wood supply so fast, I'm afraid we won't make it to spring. You're comfortable in here using less wood. Then I burn in 4 hours. Heinrich invited Morrison to examine the dugout's construction details that created its thermal efficiency. The earth walls maintained steady temperature regardless of surface conditions, requiring only modest supplemental heating to reach comfortable living conditions. The compact interior volume heated quickly and retained warmth longer than large spaces, while the central chimney location distributed heat evenly without the dead spots that plagued corner fireplaces in frame houses. Most important thing, Heinrich explained, gesturing toward the limestone walls that surrounded them. House works with earth, not against earth. Earth wants to stay 50 degrees always. I help earth warm up a little bit more. Earth helps me stay warm all night. Your house fights against earth, fights against wind, fights against cold. House that fights everything loses fight when winter gets serious. The technical demonstration was convincing, but Morrison found himself confronting social and cultural barriers that went beyond engineering principles. Adopting earth-sheltered construction meant abandoning American building traditions that represented progress and civilization in favor of immigrant methods that appeared primitive to established settlers. The dugout's invisibility from the road, its association with poverty in American minds, and its departure from conventional homestead appearance created psychological obstacles that were harder to overcome than technical challenges. Yet the mathematics of survival were becoming impossible to ignore. Morrison calculated that Heinrich was achieving comfortable heating with 1/8 the fuel consumption required by frame construction, and doing so with greater reliability and interior comfort. The efficiency differential wasn't marginal. It was the difference between sustainable winter living and a desperate struggle against fuel exhaustion that threatened family survival. Other neighbors began arriving at Heinrich's door with increasing frequency as January's severe weather continued without relief. The Kowalski family appeared one evening when their own heating system could no longer maintain livable interior temperatures. 3 other families found reasons to visit during the coldest afternoons, lingering in the dugout's steady warmth before returning reluctantly to their own frigid homes. Heinrich welcomed everyone with the quiet hospitality of a man whose construction methods had proven themselves beyond doubt, sharing warmth that his thermal engineering made abundant rather than precious. February 15, 1881, marked the beginning of what meteorologists would later classify as the most severe Arctic outbreak in recorded plains history. An enormous high-pressure system centered over northern Canada drove temperatures across Kansas to 40 degrees below zero and held them there for 5 consecutive days. Wind speeds sustained at 40 to 50 miles per hour created wind chill values approaching 75 below zero, conditions that could freeze exposed human flesh in less than 2 minutes and test every aspect of frontier construction beyond its design limits. Tom Morrison's frame house crossed the threshold from uncomfortable to uninhabitable on the second day of the cold outbreak. Despite feeding his cast iron stove every 90 minutes around the clock, burning wood so fast that the firebox glowed cherry red, interior temperature dropped to 18 degrees by the morning of February 16th. Water froze solid in buckets placed 4 feet from the stove. Frost accumulated on interior walls in patterns that traced every structural timber as cold conducted through the wooden frame faster than radiant heat could warm the air. The physical reality of extreme cold exposed every weakness in Morrison's construction with scientific precision. Heat loss through the thin walls, roof, and floor exceeded heat production by such a wide margin that continuous fuel input could not overcome the deficit. Wind infiltration through wall joints created convection currents that carried away heated air as fast as the stove could warm it, while the elevated construction ensured that every square inch of the structure remained exposed to wind cooling that made heating attempts futile. Morrison's wood supply, carefully calculated to last through a normal plains winter, reached exhaustion on February 17th. He began feeding his stove with interior furnishings, chairs, a wooden table, sections of interior wall paneling that he pried loose with desperate efficiency. By February 18th, he was burning structural elements of his own house, pulling up floorboards and cutting wall studs to feed a fire that could barely maintain interior temperatures above the freezing point, despite consuming the building itself as fuel. The Kowalski family faced identical crisis with even less structural margin for survival. John Kowalski had progressed from burning fence posts to dismantling his barn, carrying frozen lumber piece by piece through waist-deep snowdrifts to feed a heating system that was losing the battle against physics. His infant son developed the blue-tinged complexion that indicated the early stages of hypothermia, despite being wrapped in every blanket the family owned and held continuously near the stove. 3 other frame houses in the township reached similar critical points as the Arctic outbreak continued without relief. The Anderson family burned their wagon, their chicken coop, and finally interior walls of their own home in a desperate attempt to maintain core body temperature. The Swedish log cabin, more efficient than frame construction but still inadequately designed for sustained extreme cold, required fuel consumption that exceeded the family's total wood supply by the 4th day of the crisis. The community was discovering that American construction methods, adequate for the milder winters of eastern settlements, had fundamental design flaws that became fatal when exposed to high plains weather systems. Houses that had seemed sturdy and well built during moderate conditions revealed themselves as wooden boxes that could not contain heat when environmental conditions reached the extremes that characterized true plains winters. Heinrich Zimmermann's dugout maintained its steady thermal performance as if the surface weather crisis was happening on another planet. Interior temperature held at 48 degrees, with the same fuel consumption that had proven adequate since November. 12 split logs per day burned in 2 fires, morning and evening. The earth-sheltered walls remained completely unaffected by surface air temperature or wind conditions, maintaining their thermal mass function that stored and released heat on a 12-hour cycle calibrated to human comfort rather than external weather variables. The dugout's thermal stability during extreme conditions demonstrated principles that Heinrich's Volga German ancestors had refined through generations of survival in climates where 40 below temperatures were routine rather than exceptional. Deep earth temperature remained constant at 50 degrees regardless of surface conditions, providing a foundation of warmth that required only modest supplemental heating to achieve comfortable living conditions. The limestone walls and compact interior created thermal efficiency that made extreme cold irrelevant to interior climate control. Anna Zimmermann continued her normal domestic routines while other families struggled for survival. She baked bread on February 17th while Morrison was dismantling furniture for fuel. She maintained her children's educational schedule, conducting reading lessons at their wooden table where oil lamp illumination provided adequate light for learning. The children played on the floor in light clothing while their parents worked comfortably without the layers of coats and blankets that had become survival gear for frame house families. Morrison arrived at Heinrich's door near midnight on February 19th, carrying his youngest child bundled in every piece of fabric his family owned. Wind had blown snow against his house in drifts that reached the roof line, while interior temperature had dropped to levels that threatened immediate danger from hypothermia. His wood supply was exhausted. His house was being dismantled piece by piece for fuel, and his family faced death from cold before dawn. "Heinrich," Morrison said simply, his breath forming ice crystals in the bitter air, "we can't stay warm. Can you take us in?" Heinrich opened his door without hesitation. ushering the Morrison family into warmth that felt miraculous after hours of exposure to interior temperatures barely above zero. The dugout's steady 48-degree climate seemed tropical by comparison to the conditions they had escaped, and Morrison's children stopped shivering. For the first time in 3 days, as the earth-sheltered walls radiated stored heat that no external weather could disturb. The Kowalski family appeared 2 hours later, Jan carrying his infant son, while Katerina struggled through snowdrifts with their other children. Then the Andersons arrived, followed by the Swedish family, whose log cabin had finally succumbed to heating demands that exceeded any reasonable fuel supply. By dawn on February 20th, 18 people were sheltered in Heinrich's dugout, a structure designed for a family of 5, but demonstrating scalability that seemed to improve with increased occupancy. The additional body heat from 18 occupants actually enhanced the dugout's thermal efficiency rather than straining its capacity. Each person generated approximately 1,500 British thermal units per hour, adding significant heat input to the structure's thermal mass system. The compact space reached optimal capacity without overcrowding, while the entrance tunnel continued providing adequate ventilation to prevent stuffiness despite the increased population. Heinrich's small sheet iron stove, supplemented by collective body heat and thermal mass storage, easily maintained interior temperature at 58 degrees, warmer than the dugout had ever been during normal occupancy. The crisis that had threatened to kill multiple families became a demonstration of Heinrich's engineering principles working at maximum efficiency. Thermal mass that had stored heat for one family now stored and redistributed heat for 18 people, creating interior climate stability that made the surface weather crisis irrelevant to human survival. The dugout had become not just a shelter, but a life-saving refuge that proved traditional knowledge superior to conventional construction when environmental conditions reached their extremes. Morrison sat near Heinrich's stove on the morning of February 21st, calculating the fuel efficiency that was keeping 18 people alive. Heinrich's daily wood consumption remained unchanged despite quadrupled occupancy, 12 split logs providing adequate heat for a population that would have required 70 to 80 logs daily using frame house heating methods. The mathematical reality was undeniable. Heinrich's primitive construction had achieved heating efficiency that exceeded American building methods by a factor of 6, making the difference between community survival and community disaster. March 3, 1881, brought the first temperature above freezing in 17 days, signaling the end of the Arctic outbreak that had tested plain settlement construction beyond all previous limits. As snow began melting under a weak spring sun, the transformation in community attitudes toward Heinrich Zimmermann's building methods became as visible as the damage to conventional houses scattered across Rooks County. Tom Morrison stood in the ruins of his frame house, interior, walls stripped for fuel, floorboards pulled up and burned, structural elements compromised by desperate heating attempts, and began planning construction that would never again depend on fighting the plains climate. Morrison walked the perimeter of his damaged home, calculating replacement costs that exceeded his original construction investment. Rebuilding with conventional methods would require $85 in lumber plus the time and labor he had already invested once before. The mathematical comparison was unavoidable. Heinrich's dugout had cost $52 in materials and had sheltered 18 people through the worst weather crisis in regional history, while Morrison's expensive frame house had nearly killed his own family, despite consuming structural elements as emergency fuel. The technical knowledge transfer began immediately. Morrison approached Heinrich with the humility of a man who had discovered that survival trumped social conventions, requesting detailed instruction in earth-sheltered construction methods that he had mocked 6 months earlier. Heinrich responded with the patient. Teaching that characterized immigrants who understood that community survival depended on sharing proven techniques rather than protecting trade secrets. Heinrich explained the site selection principles that govern successful dugout construction. South-facing slopes captured maximum solar gain during short winter days, while natural drainage channeled spring runoff away from the structure. Excavation depth of 6 to 8 feet placed living space below the frost line, where earth temperature remained constant at 50 degrees year-round. The limestone walls extending 2 feet above ground level provided moisture control that prevented the flooding problems Morrison had worried about, while proper drainage ditches ensured that spring snowmelt flowed around rather than into the excavated space. The roof construction methods that Heinrich demonstrated incorporated engineering principles that American settlers had never encountered. Timber frame design calculated load distribution for both dead weight and live snow loads that could exceed 4 feet depth during severe winters. The 18-inch sod layering in 3 courses, grass down, grass up, grass down, created waterproof insulation with an R value equivalent to modern construction standards while using entirely local materials that cost nothing beyond labor investment. Morrison's new dugout, begun in April 1881, incorporated every technique Heinrich had refined through Volga German building traditions. The excavation followed Heinrich's precise specifications: 14 feet by 20 feet interior dimensions, 6 1/2 feet depth, south-facing orientation for solar heating. Morrison invested in quality limestone blocks rather than trying to economize with inferior materials, understanding that thermal mass efficiency depended on proper stone selection and installation techniques that Heinrich supervised with exacting standards. The entrance tunnel construction revealed sophisticated ventilation engineering that Morrison had not appreciated during his previous visits to Heinrich's dugout. The angled tunnel created natural airflow that prevented carbon monoxide buildup while maintaining heat retention through double-door airlock effects. Interior air quality remained fresh, without the stuffiness that plagued poorly ventilated frame houses, while heat loss through the entrance remained minimal even during frequent use by large families. Jan Kowalski hired Heinrich as primary contractor for Polish family dugout construction, paying him $25 plus materials for professional consultation that ensured proper thermal mass installation and drainage engineering. Heinrich's reputation as the township's earth-sheltered construction expert grew beyond ethnic immigrant communities to include American-born settlers who valued survival over social appearances. The fuel efficiency measurements from Morrison's completed dugout validated every claim Heinrich had made about heating cost reduction. Morrison's new earth-sheltered home required 2 1/2 cords of wood per month during severe cold compared to the 12-plus cords his frame house had consumed before structural failure. Heating costs dropped from $144 per winter to $36 per winter, a 75% reduction that paid for construction costs within 2 heating seasons. Community adoption accelerated as practical results overcame cultural resistance to immigrant building methods. 7 families in Rooks County built dugouts or earth-sheltered additions during the 1881 construction season, creating a parallel housing stock that provided heating security against future extreme weather events. The social stigma that had initially attached to underground living dissolved as American families discovered that earth-sheltered construction enabled comfortable frontier living rather than mere survival. County Agricultural Extension Agent Samuel Porter documented the heating efficiency measurements that validated earth-sheltered construction for official state recommendations. Porter's report to the Kansas State Agricultural Department included precise fuel consumption comparisons, construction cost analyses, and temperature monitoring data that demonstrated dugout superiority for plain settlement conditions. His official endorsement carried institutional weight that encouraged broader adoption throughout western Kansas counties. The Rooks County Gazette published a detailed technical article in September 1881 describing dugout construction methods with step-by-step instructions and material specifications. Editor Charles Whitman, who had mocked Russian burrows 3 years earlier, now credited Heinrich Zimmermann as the local authority whose expertise had saved multiple families from death by freezing during the previous winter's crisis. Immigration letters carried dugout knowledge throughout the German-Russian communities scattered across the Great Plains, spreading Heinrich's technical improvements beyond Rooks County to settlements in Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas. Archaeological evidence from these regions shows increased earth-sheltered construction during the 1880s, often incorporating the limestone lining and entrance tunnel features that Heinrich had demonstrated in Kansas. The broader historical impact extended far beyond individual construction projects. University of Kansas archaeological studies conducted in the 1920s identified Rooks County dugout sites with superior preservation compared to frame house foundations, demonstrating the structural durability that Heinrich had built into his methods. Oral history interviews collected by the Kansas State Historical Society preserved first-hand accounts from Plains homesteaders who credited dugout construction with family survival during the 1881 winter crisis. Modern passive solar architecture recognizes principles that Heinrich implemented using entirely traditional techniques and local materials. Contemporary earth-sheltered home design incorporates the same thermal mass storage, southern solar exposure, and wind protection strategies that kept the Zimmermann family comfortable through 17 Kansas winters. Energy efficiency standards that define current sustainable construction echo thermal engineering concepts that Heinrich learned from his grandfather's Volga German building traditions. Heinrich Zimmermann never claimed credit for inventing earth-sheltered construction or sought recognition for saving his neighbors' lives during the killing winter of 1881. He simply continued applying knowledge that his family had accumulated through generations of survival in climates where proper construction meant the difference between life and death. The Earth maintained its steady 50-degree temperature regardless of surface weather conditions, offering thermal stability to anyone willing to work with natural properties rather than against them. Heinrich's dugout sheltered his family through 17 Kansas winters until they built a larger surface home in 1895, but the dugout remained their root cellar, workshop, and emergency shelter until 1920. When Tom Morrison's grandson interviewed him in 1943, Morrison's final assessment of that terrible winter remained unchanged. Heinrich's hole in the ground was the warmest place in Kansas,